What if the price of seeing the truth was loneliness? Jung said that lucidity cuts like a blade. It reveals masks, breaks illusions, and forces us to choose between belonging or remain authentic. How far are you willing to see? There's a type of person who sees beyond appearances, who perceives the contradictions, the whispered lies, the power games disguised as kindness. Carl Jung called this hyperlucidity, an ability to see through the personas we all use. But this clarity exacts a high price: isolation. When you develop the ability to see people as they really are, when you can identify the social masks and unconscious patterns that govern human behavior, something inevitable happens. You become a stranger in the world itself. Superficial conversations lose their meaning. Relationships based on illusions fall apart. And you're faced with a brutal choice: pretend you don't see in order to belong, or accept the loneliness that comes with radical authenticity. Jung knew this. He himself lived this experience when he delved into the depths of the collective unconscious and discovered truths that society prefers to ignore. Today we're going to explore why those who see too much end up alone, and how to turn that loneliness into inner strength. 1. The fatal price. When Carl Jung began to study the depths of the human mind, he discovered something disturbing. There is a type of person who develops an almost supernatural ability to see through appearances. These people can identify lies even before they are uttered, perceive manipulations disguised as kindness, and detect falsehood where others see only normality. Jung called this hyperlucidity and found that it exacts a devastating price. The fatal price of extreme clarity is not only social isolation, it is the impossibility of going back. Once you develop this ability to see beyond social masks, you can no longer turn it off. It's as if someone has removed a filter from your eyes and now you see the world in high definition, including all the details you'd rather not see. Jung observed that these people go through an inevitable process of disillusionment. First, they realize that most relationships are based on mutual convenience, not genuine connection. Then they discover that everyday conversations are empty rituals, automatic repetitions of phrases with no real meaning. Finally, they understand that the whole society works like a theater where everyone plays roles, but few know who they really are behind the performance. This excessive clarity creates a cruel paradox. The more you understand about human nature, the less you can connect with people. You become like an adult trying to play make-believe with children, knowing that it is just a game but being the only one aware of it. Spontaneity dies, naivety disappears, and with them, the ability to form bonds based on shared illusions. Jung realized that these people face an impossible choice: pretend they don't see in order to maintain relationships, or accept the isolation that comes with radical honesty. Most choose a painful middle ground, living in constant tension between authenticity and belonging. They become silent observers of the human comedy, participating when necessary, but always maintaining a protective emotional distance. The cruelest aspect of this process is that it usually happens to people who are naturally empathetic and sensitive. Ironically, those who most desire genuine connection are the ones who develop the ability to see through false connections. It is as if the very thirst for authenticity creates a lens that reveals the lack of it everywhere. Jung documented this phenomenon in his studies of individuation, the process by which a person truly becomes himself. He discovered that seeing too much is not a choice, but an inevitable consequence of psychological growth. And the price is always the same: the existential loneliness of those who see beyond the veil of collective illusions. 2. Hyperlucidity kills. Hyperlucidity is like a superpower that no one has to have. Jung discovered that certain people develop an extreme sensitivity to the unconscious patterns that govern human behavior. They can read micro-expressions, detect incongruities between words and actions, and perceive hidden motivations with almost frightening accuracy. But this extraordinary ability becomes a curse when you realize you can't turn it off anymore. Imagine having to live knowing exactly when someone is lying, manipulating, or feigning interest. Imagine noticing that the person in front of you is projecting a fake image, but having to continue the conversation as if nothing is happening. Hyperlucidity turns every social interaction into an exercise in self-control, where you constantly have to decide whether to reveal what you see or keep the peace by pretending not to notice. Jung observed that these people go through a process of symbolic death. The ability to believe in appearances dies. The possibility of letting oneself be carried away by empty promises dies. The ability to participate in superficial conversations without feeling an existential emptiness dies. It is as if an essential part of the human experience, The ability to live on the surface has been completely eliminated. What makes hyperlucidity even more devastating is that it often develops as a defense mechanism. People who have experienced trauma, manipulation, or abandonment often develop this ability as a form of protection. They learn to read subtle cues to avoid future disappointment. But what begins as protection becomes prison. Society is not prepared to deal with hyperlucid people. They make others feel uncomfortable without even trying. Their mere presence can be disturbing because they see through the masks everyone wears. It's like having someone who can see you naked at a party where everyone is clothed. People feel like they're being seen for real, and that terrifies them. Jung realized that hyperlucidity creates a unique isolation. It is not just being alone physically, but being alone in the perception of reality. It's like being the only sober person at a party where everyone is drunk. You see what's really going on, but you can't share that vision without becoming the killjoy. The cruelest aspect of hyperlucidity is that it kills the possibility of relationships based on mutual illusions. And the inconvenient truth is that most human relationships depend on a certain degree of shared self-deception. When you can no longer participate in this collective self-deception, you become a foreigner in your own world. Hyperlucidity kills naivety, and with it, a specific form of happiness that is only possible when you don't see too much. 3. Masks fall. Jung discovered something revolutionary about human nature. We all wear masks, what he called a persona. But there is a brutal difference between those who wear masks consciously and those who have become slaves to them. When you develop the ability to see through these personas, you witness a spectacle that is both fascinating and disturbing, the exact moment when the masks fall. Imagine being in a work meeting and realizing that your boss, who always presents himself as confident and collected, is actually desperate for approval. You see through the upright posture, the firm voice, the calculated smile, and you see a frightened child trying to impress authority figures who exist only in his mind. The leadership mask slips off for a few seconds, and you see the raw vulnerability behind it. Or notice that person who always posts perfect photos on social media talking about gratitude and positivity. When you meet her in person, you notice the anxiety in her eyes, the compulsive need for validation, the existential emptiness disguised as spirituality. The mask of perfect happiness unravels before those who know where to look. Jung realized that these revelations happen constantly to hyperlucid people. They witness intimate moments of involuntary truth, when someone forgets to hold the performance for a few seconds and reveals who they really are. It's like having access to the backstage of a theater where everyone plays roles, but few remember what the original script is. The problem is that seeing the masks falling off creates a complex ethical dilemma. Should you pretend you didn't see it? Should you confront the person with his own falsehood? Should you simply accept that everyone lives in constant representation? Most hyperlucid people learn to keep silence, becoming involuntary depositories of the secrets that masks try to hide. But there is something liberating in this process as well. When you stop believing in other people's masks, you automatically question your own. Jung called this shadow work, the process of recognizing and integrating the aspects of ourselves that we prefer to hide. Seeing through other people's personas is the first step to letting go of your own. The fall of the masks reveals a comforting truth. Everyone is faking it to some extent. That person who seems to have their life sorted out is struggling with their own insecurities. The individual who presents himself as superior is compensating for feelings of inadequacy. The discovery that no one really knows what they're doing can be paradoxically reassuring. Jung observed that people who are able to see through masks develop a unique form of compassion. It is not naive compassion based on idealizations, but a mature compassion that accepts the imperfect humanity behind all performances. They learn to love people not in spite of their masks, but including the desperate need that everyone has to wear them. 4. Exposed shadows. Carl Jung revolutionized psychology when he introduced the concept of shadow, that part of ourselves that we reject, deny, and project onto others. But for hyperlucid people, shadow is not just a theoretical concept. They can see in real time people's shadows manifesting themselves through unconscious behaviors, projections, and primitive defense mechanisms. Think of that person who constantly criticizes others for being fake or shallow. For those with trained eyes, it's obvious that she's designing her own fight with authenticity. Or observe someone who gets excessively irritated by the laziness of others when in fact they are fighting their own tendency to procrastination. The shadow always reveals itself through what bothers us most in others. Jung discovered that the shadow operates as a psychological protection mechanism. It is easier to see in others the defects that we cannot accept in ourselves. But people with keen perception can identify this process happening in real time. They see when someone is projecting, when they are denying obvious aspects of their personality, when they are creating external enemies to avoid confronting internal demons. The most disturbing aspect of seeing exposed shadows is realizing how they govern seemingly rational behaviors. That colleague who always sabotages team projects may be unconsciously repeating patterns of self-sabotage that they learned in childhood. The person who cannot maintain stable relationships may be reproducing the fear of abandonment through behaviors that guarantee exactly what they fear most. But seeing the shadows of others also forces you to confront your own. Jung called this the mirror effect. When you identify dark patterns in others, you inevitably recognize similar versions in yourself. It is a painful process, but necessary for real psychological growth. The difference is that hyperlucid people can no longer deny or ignore these revelations. There is a cruel irony in this process. The more you understand about shadows and projections, the harder it becomes to judge others. You realize that seemingly malicious behaviors are often manifestations of unhealed wounds. Anger turns into compassion, but a compassion that comes with loneliness, because few can operate at that level of psychological understanding. Jung noted that consciously working with the shadow is one of the most challenging aspects of individuation. It requires courage to see unpleasant aspects of yourself and wisdom to integrate these discoveries without becoming cynical or bitter. For people who see shadows constantly exposed, this work becomes a daily necessity for emotional survival. The end result of this process is a unique form of psychological freedom. When you stop denying your own shadow and stop clashing with that of others, you develop a radical acceptance of the human condition. You become able to love imperfect people without trying to change them, including yourself. 5. Toxic empathy. Jung identified a devastating phenomenon that especially affects sensitive people. Empathy can become a psychological prison. When you develop the ability to feel the emotions of others as if they were your own. When you can perceive unspoken pain and pick up on subtle emotional states, something dangerous happens. You become an unwitting absorber of the suffering of others, carrying burdens that are not yours. Toxic empathy is not just about feeling for others. It is the inability to establish healthy emotional boundaries. Imagine walking into a room and immediately catching one person's anxiety, another's disguised sadness, a third's pent-up anger. Your nervous system reacts as if all these emotions are yours. You leave home balanced and return home carrying the emotional weight of dozens of people. Jung noticed that highly empathetic people often develop what he called the savior complex. They feel a compulsive responsibility to alleviate the suffering of others, even when it means sacrificing their own well-being. They become unlicensed therapists for friends, family, and even strangers, offering a shoulder to cry on and advice for problems they can't solve. The cruelest aspect of toxic empathy is that it attracts emotionally vampiric people. Individuals with narcissistic or parasitic tendencies can identify empaths from afar. They gravitate toward these people like magnets, sucking in emotional energy without offering anything in return. The empath becomes a bottomless pit of understanding and support, while the emotional vampire feeds on this infinite generosity. But there is a liberating discovery in this process. Jung noted that excessive empathy often masks a subtle form of arrogance. When you assume that you can save others, you are implicitly putting yourself in a superior position. When you feel like you have to carry other people's emotions, you're denying others the ability to deal with their own problems. Toxic empathy can be a disguised form of control. The cure for toxic empathy is not to become desensitized, but to develop what Jung called detached compassion. It is the ability to understand the suffering of others without absorbing it, to offer support without sacrificing, to love without getting lost in the process. It requires learning the difference between healthy empathy and emotional codependency. Jung found that people who overcome toxic empathy develop a more mature form of human connection. They can be there for others without becoming responsible for the emotions of others. They learn to say no without guilt, to set limits without coldness, to take care of themselves without selfishness. The result is paradoxical. When you stop trying to save everyone, you become genuinely useful to those who really need help. When you establish healthy emotional boundaries, your relationships become more authentic. Empathy ceases to be a curse and becomes a conscious gift that you choose when and how to use it. 6. Inevitable loneliness. The loneliness of those who see too much is not a choice. It is a mathematical consequence. Jung realized that there is a point of no return in the development of consciousness, when you cross a certain threshold of perception about human nature. It becomes impossible to return to the state of comfortable ignorance that allows for superficial connections. Loneliness becomes inevitable not because you reject people, but because few can operate at the level of depth that has become your new reality. Imagine trying to explain colors to someone who was born blind. This is how hyperlucid people feel when trying to share their perceptions with others. They see patterns, motivations, and dynamics that are invisible to most. When they try to verbalize these observations, they are often labeled as negative, complicated, or overthinking. Society prefers to keep its illusions intact. Jung noted that this loneliness has specific characteristics. It is not the loneliness of one who has been rejected, but the loneliness of one who has become incompatible with the prevailing level of consciousness. It's like being an adult forced into childish play, knowing it's just a game but being the only one aware of it. You can participate out of education, but genuine connection becomes impossible. The most painful aspect of this loneliness is that it often strikes at people who value authentic connections the most. Ironically, those who most desire real intimacy are the ones who develop the ability to detect falsehood in relationships. They become like emotional lie detectors, able to identify when someone is faking interest, manipulating, or simply repeating empty social scripts. But Jung discovered something comforting about this loneliness. It forces a specific kind of inner growth. When you can no longer rely on external validation or superficial connections, you are bound to develop a solid relationship with yourself. Solitude becomes a laboratory for self-knowledge, a space where you can explore your own depths without outside interference. Inevitable loneliness also teaches a valuable lesson about quality versus quantity in relationships. When you stop trying to fit into groups or maintain friendships based on convenience, you make room for rare but genuine connections. Jung realized that people who go through this process often find one or two deeply authentic relationships that make up for the loss of dozens of superficial connections. There is a unique freedom in this solitude. When you accept that you don't need to be understood by everyone, you stop modifying your personality to please others. When you recognize that most people operate at different levels of consciousness, you stop being frustrated by misunderstandings. Loneliness is transformed from punishment to privilege. Jung concluded that inevitable loneliness is a rite of passage to real psychological maturity. It is the price one pays for seeing beyond collective illusions. But it is also the gateway to a more authentic way of existing in the world. 7. Impossible escape. Jung discovered a brutal truth about the development of consciousness. Once you awaken to certain realities about human nature, there is no way back. It's like trying to unlearn how to read or pretending you don't understand a language you master perfectly. Escape becomes impossible because expanded perception is not a skill you can turn off. It is a permanent transformation of the way you process reality. Many people who develop hyperlucidity go through a desperate phase trying to get back to the previous state of comfortable ignorance. They try to force themselves to believe superficial conversations, pretend they don't notice obvious manipulations, or convince themselves that that person has really changed this time. But it's like trying to believe Santa Claus after finding out that it's the parents who put the presents under the tree. Knowledge cannot be unknown. The impossibility of escape creates a specific form of existential claustrophobia. You feel trapped in a reality that few can see or recognize. It's like being in a horror movie where you're the only one who notices the monster is in the room, but everyone else keeps talking normally. The constant tension between what you see and what others pretend not to see can be mentally exhausting. Jung realized that this impossibility of return forces a fundamental choice. You can become bitter and cynical, or you can accept your new perspective as a different kind of responsibility. Some people choose the path of bitterness, becoming constant critics of human hypocrisy. Others learn to carry their knowledge with compassion, understanding that not everyone is ready to see what they see. The most challenging aspect of impossible escape is that it eliminates many traditional forms of entertainment and escape. Movies with predictable scripts lose their fun when you can anticipate every twist. Social conversations become exercises in patience when you realize that they are just repetitions of cultural scripts. Even romantic relationships can lose their charm when you see through the projections and fantasies that typically underpin the initial infatuation. But Jung discovered that the impossibility of escape also offers a unique form of freedom. When you stop trying to escape your expanded perception and accept that it is a permanent part of who you have become, you can begin to use it consciously. Instead of being a victim of your own clarity, you become the master of it. The impossible escape teaches a valuable lesson about radical authenticity. When you can no longer pretend not to see, you are forced to live according to your inner truth. This can be isolating, but it is also profoundly liberating. You stop wasting energy trying to fit into realities that no longer make sense to you. Jung concluded that the impossibility of return is actually a gift in disguise. It forces you to develop internal resources that people living on the surface never have to cultivate. You become more resilient, more self-sufficient, and paradoxically more capable of genuine connections, even if they are rarer. 8. Brutal individuation. Jung considered individuation to be the most important and painful process of human life, truly becoming who you are, rather than who others expect you to be. But for hyperlucid people, this process becomes especially brutal because they can no longer hide behind comforting illusions about themselves or the world. Individuation becomes a direct and relentless confrontation with the naked reality of one's own nature. The process begins when you realize that you've spent your entire life playing roles created by family expectations, social pressures, and unresolved trauma. You discover that your personality is a collage of personas designed to survive in different contexts, but that none of them represent who you really are underneath all the layers of conditioning. It's like discovering that you're an actor who has forgotten your original identity after playing so many different characters. Jung observed that individuation forces you to confront aspects of yourself that you would rather ignore. You need to recognize your own manipulative tendencies, your primitive defense mechanisms, your unconscious projections, and your self-destructive patterns. It's a process of psychological autopsy while he's still alive, dissecting every aspect of his personality to separate what's authentic from what's just conditioned reaction. The brutality of individuation intensifies when you realize how many of your life choices have been based on attempts to please others or avoid rejection. Relationships, careers, hobbies, even moral values can all be questioned when you begin to distinguish between what genuinely resonates with you and what has been absorbed from the environment. It's like discovering that your entire life has been built on foundations that aren't yours. The most terrifying aspect of individuation is that it requires you to let go of versions of yourself that may have worked for decades. You need to symbolically kill the me that was created to survive in circumstances that no longer exist. It's a kind of living death where you need to let aspects of your identity die so that something more authentic can be born. Jung realized that individuation is especially difficult for empathetic people because they need to learn to disappoint others in order to stay true to themselves. This goes against all the instincts of people who have spent their lives trying to maintain harmony and avoid conflict. They need to develop the courage to be misunderstood, judged, or even rejected by those who preferred the earlier, more accommodating version. But the brutality of individuation also reveals its absolute necessity. Jung found that people who avoid this process remain trapped in unconscious patterns that prevent them from living fully. They become puppets of psychological forces they don't understand, repeating the same mistakes and attracting the same problematic situations over and over again. The end result of brutal individuation is a form of psychological integrity that few experience. You become able to act from your authentic center rather than reacting from unhealed wounds. It develops the ability to be alone without feeling lonely, to love without getting lost, to connect without committing. 9. Forca is born. Jung made a revolutionary discovery. True strength is not born from the absence of pain, but from the ability to transform suffering into wisdom. For people who have gone through the brutal process of seeing too much and facing the inevitable loneliness, something extraordinary happens. The same sensitivity that isolated them from the world becomes the source of an unshakable inner strength. It's as if the fire that burned your illusions has forged a different kind of psychological resistance. This strength is not the superficial harshness of those who close themselves emotionally. It's the resilient flexibility of those who have learned to navigate human complexity without getting lost in the process. People who develop this strength are able to remain open and compassionate even after witnessing the worst of human nature. They become like trees that have survived storms, more rooted, more flexible, and paradoxically better able to offer shelter to others. Jung realized that this strength emerges from the radical acceptance of the human condition. When you stop fighting the reality that people are imperfect, contradictory, and often unaware of their own motivations, you develop an inner peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. You become capable of loving humanity not in spite of its faults, but by including all of them. The strength that is born of hyperlucidity has unique characteristics. It is a force that does not need to prove itself, that does not seek external validation, that is not shaken by criticism or rejection. It's like having developed an emotional immune system that can process toxicity without being contaminated by it. You become impervious to manipulation because you can identify them instantly. But you also don't become cynical because you understand the wounds that motivate them. The most powerful aspect of this force is that it allows for a unique form of quiet leadership. People who have gone through this process of transformation often become points of reference for others, even without trying. Their mere presence communicates an emotional stability that appeals to those who are tired of drama and superficiality. They become beacons for other navigators lost in the ocean of human confusion. Jung noted that this force also unleashes a specific creativity. When you no longer have to expend energy maintaining masks or trying to fit in, all that energy becomes available for authentic expression. Many people who go through this process discover artistic, intellectual, or spiritual talents that have been dormant under layers of social conformity. The strength born of conscious solitude also develops a particular form of courage. It's the courage to live up to your values even when it means being alone. It is the courage to speak inconvenient truths when necessary. It's the courage to set healthy boundaries even when it disappoints people who have grown accustomed to its unlimited availability. Jung concluded that this force represents a real psychological evolution. People who develop it become less dependent on external approval, less reactive to emotional provocations, and better able to respond to difficult situations from a center of inner calm. They transform themselves from victims of their own sensibility to masters of their own emotional experience. 10. Absolute freedom. The journey of seeing too much culminates in a paradoxical discovery. Absolute freedom comes not from having more options, but from no longer needing anyone's approval to be who you really are. Jung realized that there is a kind of freedom that can only be achieved by those who have gone through the fire of total disillusionment and emerged on the other side with their authenticity intact. It is the freedom of those who no longer need to belong to feel complete. This absolute freedom manifests itself first as emotional independence. You become able to enjoy the company of others without depending on it for your psychological stability. Relationships transform from needs into conscious choices. You can love deeply without getting lost in the process. You can connect intimately without fear of abandonment. You can give of yourself without emptying yourself. It's like having developed an internal gravitational center so strong that nothing external can take you off axis. Jung observed that people who achieve this freedom develop a unique form of presence. They no longer need to impress, convince, or please anyone. Its simple authenticity becomes magnetic in a way that all previous efforts at social manipulation have never been able to be. It's as if they've stopped trying to be interesting and, paradoxically, have become fascinating. Absolute freedom also frees you from the tyranny of social expectations. You can choose to participate in social rituals when it makes sense, but you don't feel obligated to maintain appearances that don't reflect your inner truth. It can be kind without being fake, it can be firm without being cruel, it can be vulnerable without being weak. Every action becomes a conscious choice rather than an automatic reaction to external pressures. The most revolutionary aspect of this freedom is that it allows for a completely new way of contributing to the world. When you're no longer spending energy trying to fit in or be accepted, all of that energy becomes available for greater purposes. Many people who achieve this freedom discover an authentic vocation that was hidden under layers of social conditioning. Jung realized that absolute freedom also transforms his relationship with suffering. You don't seek pain, but you don't desperately avoid it either. He understands that suffering is an inevitable part of the human experience and develops the ability to go through it without being destroyed by it. This makes you braver to live fully, knowing that you can handle any consequence. This ultimate freedom also includes the freedom to love without conditions. When you no longer need others to be different than they are in order to feel good, you can offer a kind of love that doesn't seek to change or control. It is a love that accepts human imperfection as part of the beauty of existence, not as something that needs to be corrected. Jung concluded that absolute freedom is the ultimate prize for those brave enough to face the full journey of individuation. It is the ability to live as a fully realized human being, aware of one's limitations but not limited by them, connected with others but not dependent on them, loving but not needy. It's the freedom to be exactly who you are in a world that constantly pressures you to be someone else.